Good afternoon and welcome to today's Georgetown Alumni webinar hosted by the Georgetown University Alumni Association. Thank you for taking time out of your day to connect virtually with fellow Hoyas for today's program, U.S. Trade Policy 2021 and Beyond, with Marc Busch and Collin Janich. Marc Busch is the Karl F. Landegger Professor of International Business Diplomacy at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Busch is also the academic director of the Masters in International Business and Policy program at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and hosts TradeCraft, a podcast on international trade policy and law. Collin Janich is a manager of government relations communications with Hitachi and the creator and co-host of the podcast TradeCraft. He holds a master's in international business and policy from Georgetown's McDonough School of Business and Walsh School of Foreign Service. I'm Kelly Young, Associate Director of Strategic Engagement and Alumni Relations, and I'll be facilitating today's program. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few tips and reminders. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel. You will receive a link to the recording in our follow-up email. Marc and Collin will answer audience questions towards the end of their discussion. Please send in your questions using the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. If you're having any technical difficulties or other issues, please also submit those concerns via the questions section of your control panel. Without further ado, I'm pleased to turn things over to Marc and Collin.
Kelly, thank you for your kind introduction, for having us here today. It's always a pleasure to return to Georgetown, albeit virtually, and it's a treat to talk trade with Marc Busch. Marc, the all-important 2020 election is just 39 days away, and no matter who wins and assumes the presidency in January, trade issues will be top of the agenda, specifically trade with China. As we know, President Trump has disrupted America's trade relationship with Xi Jinping's China, and has done so unilaterally. Former Vice President Joe Biden asserts that the most effective way to address China on trade is to, quote, build a united front of U.S. allies and partners to confront China's abusive behaviors. Marc, first off, identify those abusive behaviors for us just as we start here. And then the second part of that question is a multilateral approach realistic, or is it just a feel-good, well-worn talking point?
The issues with respect to China typically flow from the accusation that it's just one big state-owned enterprise, and that there's very little competition domestically within the economy that isn't orchestrated by the government. Hence, the allegations generally center on claims of subsidy. There's no doubt that there are some loopholes in subsidy practices. There are some concerns with respect to whether subsidy law at the WTO is up to the task. But we haven't heard much about that. We haven't heard much about what it is that's supposed to happen on the subsidy front. We have heard more on the intellectual property front, but there too we have a bit of a mystery. Namely, a case that the US filed in March of 2018 was ultimately let pause. And we don't have an outcome to that, even though it was the crux of the Section 301 justification for imposing tariffs on Chinese goods. The election will undoubtedly figure prominently in the eyes of the Chinese who are watching this to see whether there's going to be a thawing of relations. I doubt anytime soon that there will be. The difference will likely be in method, not in intent. And let's face it, being tough on China right now is selling domestically. But the issue will be clear and wrapped up with the broader theme, and I know that we're going to touch on this a little bit later on, namely WTO reform, and whether the institution can be even sufficiently reformed to engage the China problem as it is coming to be known.
Sure. And Marc, you mentioned Section 301. I want to dig into that quite a bit in one moment. But first, to just address Trump's tools, tariffs, most trade watchers believe that a Biden administration would likely continue the use of tariffs, even though Biden himself has called Trump's use of tariffs, quote, reckless, disastrous, and damaging. If Biden sits in the Oval Office behind the Resolute desk, can we assume a continuation of tariffs or a continuation of the threat of tariffs?
The tariffs actually have been quite appealing to many Democrats, and it's not clear that there's going to be any wavering from the use of these tariffs. The question will be in what form? Are we talking trade remedies as per past practice across prior administrations, or are we talking about 301? Now, if we're talking about 301, then the headaches are going to continue. My fear is that what we're seeing now in terms of Biden's comments on the campaign trail is that he's just going to be more systematic in applying 301, but he's going to continue to make recourse to it, despite the ruling that we got last week from the WTO, which, not to anyone's surprise, found that certain of these tariffs are illegal that were being issued under Section 301.
Yeah, let's just dive into that. So the Section 301 tariffs represent Trump's most aggressive use of tariffs, targeting hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. You know, it stemmed from investigations into forced technology transfers and IP theft. How successful have those tariffs been, and what's the prospect for them going forward?
The payoff is a mystery. It's unclear that the tariffs have done anything to get the Chinese to return to the negotiating table and address the IP directly. And let's remember that it was about IP that we first started hearing about the need for the 301 tariffs, despite the fact that Ambassador Lighthizer testified over the course of the summer that 3 out of the 4 IP issues had nothing to do with WTO law. So it was always going to be a bit of a stretch to figure out how to respond to things like forced technology transfer and questions of patentability writ large. But nonetheless, here we are. The weird thing about the 301 case is that, like I said, the US dropped its IP case against China. Europe, however, was there with us. And speaking to your multilateral theme and the question that you asked, it would have been very useful to pursue on a united front with the EU something like concessions from China with respect to forced technology transfer. The problem, though, is that we're not really using all the tools in the toolkit. One of the biggest ways in which we deal with forced technology transfer is through investor rights. And in that regard, it'd be really wonderful if we could go back in time and follow through on President Obama's desire to conclude a bilateral investment treaty with China and with India, for that matter, where, importantly, intellectual property is defined as a covered investment. That would have been yet another means by which firms directly could take matters into their own hands and seek remedies. But here we are, and we now have a ruling that is unequivocal in its view that the 301 tariffs, the 2 lists that were challenged, are in fact WTO illegal. They violate, very simply, MFN. It took the panel a mere 17 paragraphs to reason through all of the issues concerning MFN. And fortunately, and this sounds a little counterintuitive, but fortunately, the US lost by invoking an exception on public morals. Had the US won on the public morals exception, the global economy would unravel.
Right, and this panel finding just happened in mid-September. And just walk us through that a little bit in more detailed fashion. When you're saying MFN, this is most favored nation status, right? Kind of explain that a little bit more, if you would.
Yeah, so MFN is one of the twin axioms of the WTO, the other being national treatment. And MFN says that what you do to one country, you do to all. Well, when you single out China with Section 301 tariffs, clearly you're running afoul of MFN. Now, the point is that the US didn't deny that, never said anything, didn't offer one legal claim justifying 301 tariffs as being MFN compliant. Instead, the US resorted to an exception, a little used exception, one that was never going to work, and it's called GATT 20A on public morals. So the argument was essentially this: Chinese efforts at state-sponsored theft of American ideas run afoul of American sensibilities and are anathema to US views of fair and free competition.
Sure.
Didn't fly, because what the WTO requires in a case like that would be some relationship between the pursuit of these public morals issues and the tariffs themselves. None could be found, and in fact, the best the US could muster was the comment that it wasn't implausible that somehow the tariffs could contribute to making the Chinese more aware of the need for them to comply. So the ruling wasn't a surprise. In fact, what's really interesting is that the stock market largely yawned after about 45 minutes of capitalizing the information inherent in the ruling. And we end up with a lot of very grandiose statements out of politicians in Washington, but there really wasn't a lot of there. And in all truth, the panel really spared both sides of some embarrassing findings, largely because China, for some reason, dropped one of its main accusations that it had actually written into its complaint in the first place, and that was a shot at U.S. unilateralism. And it's a good thing they did for the sake of U.S. credibility, because we know how that would have ended, and that's because we lost the same ruling in 1999 to the European Union.
So what are the practical ramifications of this report then, of this panel's findings? If Biden does assume office, can he continue with those tariffs now that they've been deemed WTO illegal?
I seriously doubt the Chinese expect the tariffs to go away anytime soon. The tariffs were really almost indefensible, and I would imagine that what you're going to get is nothing for a while. First, because the appellate body is incapable right now of functioning because it's understaffed, because the U.S. is blocking new appointments. And therefore, as soon as the U.S. appeals this verdict, it will fall into the legal void of nothingness.
Right.
So nothing is going to happen in the short term. But if it does motivate some thinking about what might go into phase 2 U.S.-China, because phase 1 and its assessment is already water under the bridge, then perhaps it would allow either Trump or Biden to pivot a little bit and to get us out of this mess.
Mark, conspiracy theorists would assert that Trump, the argument they presented on 301 was legally thin. Perhaps the Trump administration is seeking a negative ruling on this 301, on this dispute settlement 543, to justify a withdrawal from the WTO. It's something that we've heard even when he was campaigning. President Trump made reference to. This idea has been picked up by prominent senators, such as Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, took to the opinion page of the New York Times to push this idea that the U.S. should withdraw from the WTO. Do you anticipate this withdrawal rhetoric intensifying because of this case and this report?
There's definitely going to be an effort to stimulate that kind of reaction to the ruling. We heard exactly that from both Ambassador Lighthizer and Senator Hawley. I don't think it's going to get much pickup. The reality is that the Senate was largely uninterested in taking up Senator Hawley's effort to consider withdrawing support of the WTO. Withdrawal from the WTO itself is just a monolithic enterprise and certainly beyond the reach of any reasonable administration with an eye to stock market performance and GDP growth in general. It really is something, though, that we are hearing for this to be the lesson drawn from the loss. I think the real lesson to be learned from the loss is that it was a blessing for the United States. The global economy and U.S. trade in particular would have unraveled were the public morals exception to have been found kosher and to have justified the violation of MFN to begin with. So I think really what we're looking at the moment is, like I said, a mess. And I would hope that phase 2 U.S.-China helps this case go away. But if it doesn't, then Biden inherits a big headache. And I wonder what his timeline is for addressing headaches of this sort, given his statements on the stump that he will be investing in U.S. infrastructure for quite some time before he turns his gaze abroad. If that's a comment to appease constituents going into November, that's one thing. But if he actually means it, he's wrong. He's going to have very little honeymoon period. These issues will have to be taken up. So will a vast host of other issues that have left U.S. trade in a quandary, including not just with China, but some of our closest allies.
Sure. And I want to return, you mentioned the appellate body, and just for our less trade inclined members of the audience, this is the highest adjudicative body of the WTO. The Trump administration, in continuation of policies under President Obama, has actually stalled appointments, judicial appointments to this body. What was the justification for that? The appellate body is now effectively stalled. It's impotent. What was the reasoning behind that, and what are the ramifications of that?
The U.S. has been angry for some time now about the WTO's handling of anti-dumping duty law and countervailing duty law. So we've been hearing this from prior administrations, and interestingly, it is a bipartisan theme that in some way, shape, or form, the appellate body in particular has engaged in judicial activism to fill in holes in WTO law to allow things that the U.S. views as being unfavorable to the application of anti-dumping countervail in particular.
Is that legit?
Well, this is certainly part of the problem of incomplete contracts and the occurrence of multiple equilibria when you read into law that is incomplete. There's something there, but the idea that somehow the way to solve it is to eradicate the notion of precedent at the WTO is both wrong-headed and detrimental to long-run U.S. trade interests going forward, especially on the offense. So in the scheme of things, over trade remedies, we're going to bring down the global economy. This is bad for U.S. agriculture in particular, which over the next few years is going to need an awful lot of export-oriented litigation to crack open markets that are shutting down not because of tariffs, but because of regulatory measures.
And along those lines, we're hearing calls for WTO reform. Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, took to the pages of Wall Street Journal in August outlining his plan for WTO reform and making his arguments there. What does WTO reform look like? What are the issues being discussed right now, and what issues is the U.S. particularly concerned about?
U.S. wants some discussion of timelines for rulings, appointments of appellate body jurists, but most importantly, something about precedent. What that something is, we don't know. We haven't heard anything. We haven't even heard a hypothetical about how a case would look if we didn't have this notion of de facto stare decisis. This is a real problem. It is unbelievable that this came out of nowhere, in as much as since 2001, the Doha round of the WTO has been entertaining reform proposals. We never heard this from anyone. And a year before the appellate body shut down, the best the EU could do was muster together one paragraph, which essentially said, let's have a gab fest and talk about whether precedent is happening. That's it.
Right.
We really need more guidance from the US in terms of what's the problem before we can actually begin to offer solutions. My big fear about the rhetoric on reform is that we're setting our sights way too high, or at least official Washington is. I really think it's time to manage expectations, because there's no magic bullet for outsourcing or offshoring or the flight of footloose capital. And the more we link reform to the China problem, the more we're in for a big letdown. It's going to be key for especially the next director general, whoever that might be, of the WTO, to manage down these expectations. And in all honesty, everyone's going to get real bored real fast when they learn what the debate is going to be about among the people who are negotiating the drafts, namely precedent, judicial activism, and add to or diminish clauses under the dispute settlement understanding. This will not impress those who think that there is a magic bullet that's going to deal with the effects of wage rate increases in the United States versus other countries, especially in the developing world.
Yeah, and Mark, I mean, for those of us on this call that are less familiar with the WTO and how it's organized and how it functions, explain for us, if you would, just its role in managing global trade. I know that, it's for a layperson, it's easy to look at what's happening right now and assume that the WTO has somehow mismanaged what's going on between the US and China, issues around digital trade, things like a country's ability to deal with state-owned enterprises. So just how does the WTO actually function in the global trading system?
Well, the WTO does two fundamental things. It offers a forum in which we see the members legislating WTO law, and then it also provides a forum in which we see the litigation, like what we witnessed with the verdict on US-China tariffs last week. The problem with so much of the discussion about the WTO is that it isn't really in a vacuum. It faces competitive pressures from all these preferential trade agreements like USMCA and other deals that are now dotting the landscape of the global economy. We're looking at a global economy today with 303 preferential trade agreements in force, almost 600 plus notified to the WTO. You have to really think that how the WTO deals with some of these issues is also a function of how it relates to these PTAs on similar or the same issues. And that's where the complexity really kicks in. As a forum that renders decisions that offer at times very constructive guidance in how to settle a dispute, and for that matter, as a forum that at times offers a ruling against a country, which is tremendously useful in helping that country comply with free trade rules and yet deflect political blame, the institution is largely a success story. No one doubts that. There is nobody except for maybe Josh Hawley presenting this institution as anything shy of a success. In fact, Robert Lighthizer said over the summer, if the WTO didn't exist, we'd have to create it. And that's absolutely right. But the added complexity of 2020 is that, unlike in 1947, the institution isn't siloed. It is interacting now with 303 PTAs that are doing extra special stuff like labor and the environment, like state-owned enterprises, like competition policy. And that means that there is action elsewhere. And since every single member of the WTO has at least one outside free trade agreement, that is not a minor fact.
Yeah, and we're using the term free trade agreement. We've used the term PTAs, preferential trade agreements. The term itself is evolving in real time right now. We've heard about phase deals and mini deals, early harvests. Mark, just what is a trade agreement? What terminology should we be using, and why does it matter that this language around trade agreements is evolving?
I'm going to show my age here because I was schooled in Canada just on the eve of the bilateral US-Canada trade deal. I was taught in college that a trade deal is supposed to be kind of what the WTO says it's supposed to be, something that covers substantially all trade. In truth, I worry that one of the biggest casualties of the Trump administration will be the term trade agreement. We are seeing now things that look more like a mere cessation of hostilities being chalked up as trade agreements. We see barter as trade agreements. We see mini deals as trade agreements. This is not what the WTO thinks is viable. And interestingly, now Ambassador Lighthizer agrees. His point is that it's time to go back to the WTO and reinvigorate the institution because the US is falling behind in the race to get big deals. And by big deals, I mean broad coverage, substantially all trade, and enforcement. So it is amazing that the USTR ambassador for an administration that came to office touting the need for bilateral deals is now backing off that and saying maybe we should rethink this because these bilateral deals are leading to a two-tier global economy. That is absolutely right. The only check on that is to ensure that deals aren't mini, to ensure that deals aren't small and barter-based and largely about a cessation of hostilities. If these deals are going to be done, let's hold them to the terms that when I was a cleared advisor to the United States Trade Representative, my committee always said very loudly, WTO plus, a good deal that's deep and broad, or no deal at all. We already have the WTO. Don't reinvent the wheel. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of things that the WTO doesn't do. We call that WTO plus. And if that's not the bar, then Biden's going to come up well short, and we're going to continue to alienate not just our enemies, but our allies.
Mark, how much does, under President Obama, we saw the Trans-Pacific Partnership tank at the very end. It was up for debate during the 2016 election. Do you think that the TPP's failure, the US's failure to join TPP, has had any impact on America's preference for multilateral deals versus bilateral deals? And do you think that if it does have an impact, that it'll be a lasting impact?
I think the decision to withdraw from getting in on TPP will go down as one of the dumbest decisions that was ever made in U.S. trade politics. We are now scrambling to essentially amass what we lost out on, namely bilats with Japan and Vietnam and others. This one was politicized in a way that made very little sense. We were looking at an agreement that covered 40% of global GDP. We needed some of those deals. We were losing to the European Union in making those bilats come to life. And the fact that the EU just got a deal with Vietnam this summer is proof positive of what Lighthizer said. The US isn't keeping up, and TPP would have been a wonderful segue. Moreover, TPP was really good text. Having worked on one of the chapters, I can say it was one of the best texts that we had. And for that matter, we got more from Canada under TPP than we did under USMCA. In fact, we should never have been in discussions to reform and revitalize NAFTA. The answer was always TPP because both Canada and Mexico joined TPP. This one should be posed to a number of politicians from 2016 as a question. Did you screw up? And the answer is yes.
I don't want to put you on the spot about EU and Vietnam, so we can open that up to any recent, bilateral deal. But draw out the actual benefits of this type of trade agreement for us, as far as how the private sector benefits from these agreements. I mean, it's easy to think about these simply as geopolitical exercises, and that's really not what we're talking about here.
These agreements are fundamentally about farmers, ranchers, businesses, labor. They're not really lofty, ambitious, aspirational documents about global peace. That may have been one of the inspirations for the original GATT text, but let's face it, businesses, laborers, ranchers, and farmers in particular, the ones that are going to make the difference in the upcoming election in those swing states, they are shortchanged to this day, given our withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They're looking around, because they were denied access to rules that were more science-based on health and safety standards, for example. They had way better protections on labeling requirements, on things that sound like country of origin labeling in particular. This was their opportunity. And for however much President Trump may throw relief dollars at these farmers in particular, they aren't being made whole. They were shortchanged. And most importantly, to get to your question, what TPP offered and what a US-EU trade deal like a US-UK trade deal will have to do is to deliver on the regulatory stuff. The embarrassment right now is that we're able to talk almost strictly about tariffs under the Trump administration. Rich countries don't use tariffs. Rich countries use regulatory stuff. There isn't a farmer out there, not one, who's going to tell you that his or her greatest fear is facing a tariff abroad. They're worried about being barred from foreign markets on the basis of health and safety standards. We need trade agreements to pry open those markets, to test the science that these sovereign states are offering as an excuse to practice disguised protectionism. That's what US agriculture needs, and that's why TPP was going to be such a big deal.
Yeah, and Mark, you had mentioned that, getting into the details of these agreements, they're not, big, they're not visionary statements or statements about, trying these larger geostrategic goals or aims. One thing that we have seen, though, that's crept into the conversation around trade agreements is the environment. It's something that we heard during USMCA. It took on quite a role. Former Vice President Joe Biden has said that he's floated the idea of a carbon adjustment fee or tariffs that are based on carbon or environmental obligations. Trace for us, if you would, just kind of how the environment has been treated in trade generally, and how you think that will look like going forward?
Trade is a big question mark when it comes to the environment. I don't think environmentalists are going to like what a trade agreement does on the environment. And let's get that straight. These are trade deals. They are not environmental deals. And they shouldn't serve as substitutes for environmental deals. They deal with the trade-related issues that arise by virtue of environmental standards, et cetera. They are not Kyoto, and they shouldn't be viewed as a substitute for Kyoto. Now, with that said, we really don't have much experience in this regard. Under NAFTA, when we started first talking about things that looked like the environment, it was really just a cleanup fund for environmental degradation along the Rio Grande. That was it. What it means now is pretty much anyone's guess in terms of litigation, because it's not the environment writ large. But I have another fear. I worry that we're going to see, unless the WTO pushes forward with the environmental goods agreement, a lot of upcoming litigation on illegal subsidies for things like wind, solar, and batteries. It's already happening because governments can't help themselves. They're imposing local content requirements as a precondition for eligibility for a subsidy. And I would suspect that green coalitions around the world are going to become rather jazzed about this, and not in a good way. It really is important, like I said before, with respect to managing expectations for WTO reform, to explain what's in the trade agreement. And what's in the trade agreement is not Kyoto. It's trade-related stuff related to environmental standards. Think about it this way. The big deal on labor and the environment was always to prevent against a race to the bottom. We've got no empirical evidence that races to the bottom are happening. Whatever else anyone thinks is written into that text, odds are they're wrong.
And Mark, I want to use this pause to just tell our audience that, if you want to submit questions for Mark, please go to the section of your GoToWebinar control panel and just insert them in there, and we'll turn to those in a moment.
Carl, we got to give a plug to TradeCraft. Your event.
No, we will. Yeah, TradeCraft. This is Mark is the host of TradeCraft podcast. If you're enjoying our conversation right here, follow us along on Twitter at TradeCraft_pod, and then also on SoundCloud and iTunes, TradeCraft podcast. So diving back into our discussion, Mark, the environment is something that's gaining momentum as far as entering into these discussions around trade. We're seeing labor also creep up into these discussions in a more forceful way than perhaps we've seen in the past. We saw that under USMCA in particular. What's the concern there as far as labor kind of entering these conversations?
From a trade agreement perspective, the text is written to do exactly what I said a moment before, deal with things that look like a competitive race to the bottom. That is not what we heard when the House convened a session on the need for strict enforcement of labor standards. There, the view was that somehow we could write labor standards in trade agreements that would deal with wage differentials. Ain't gonna happen. There's nothing that you can write in the form of any given trade text that's gonna deal with or subvert comparative advantage. And that's my fear about how labor standards are being interpreted, especially in the media today. They see it as being a quick fix for declining competitiveness due to wage increases in the US, or for that matter, as a knee-jerk reaction for dealing with the fact that automation is taking over on the shop floor. Neither is going to be remedied by writing a labor chapter into a given trade agreement, and the conversation had in the House committee was really worrisome, both from an economic standpoint and from a political one. Don't get me wrong, the US didn't invent this. We have Canadian and EU trade deals with labor standards. In fact, we have an EU-Canada trade deal that has labor standards. The question is, what is this going to deliver? And under what circumstances? And is it what labor constituents think? Because for the AFL-CIO, I can tell you this, it's not the answer. And to let down labor, organized labor in particular, isn't necessarily going to be conducive to helping the US catch up with the European Union in signing trade deals going forward.
Yeah, and we keep framing this as a competition among countries, a race to sign more and more trade deals. The US is lagging heavily behind the EU on that front when it comes to inking trade agreements. Do you expect either a Biden or Trump administration to accelerate the pace of preferential trade agreements?
My bet is that a Trump administration part 2 would certainly begin to think through the US-UK opportunity, maybe en route, and this is my hope, to a US-EU trade deal. Let's be clear, we don't need to catch up just in terms of sheer numbers. We're 30 behind the EU right now in 2020. We're not catching up anytime soon, but we need one deal. And we need that deal in order to prevent USMCA from failing. And that deal is called TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the US-EU bilateral. That's the deal we need. So if the future administration, regardless of who wins, is going to set its sights on economizing resources, that's the priority. Do WTO reform first and do US-EU second. No two ways about it. So it is a staggering statistic that the EU just cinched its 44th trade deal and the US got its 13th. That's a big gap, big delta.
Right.
But we're never going to, in the short term, catch up. And we shouldn't even be trying. The pivot should be to our friends under the Trans-Pacific Partnership and ultimately, first and foremost, in terms of PTAs, to Europe. But you start with getting the WTO back up and working, because it will ultimately be the backstop for all of this.
Yeah, and I don't want to focus too heavily on this, but what are the sticking points right now to a US-EU deal? It seems, we seem to be solid allies. There's been some trade friction, but generally the US and the EU are on the same page about a lot of issues. What are the sticking points when it comes to trade?
We have populism creeping up in the EU, just like we have populism here in the United States. And for that matter, Europe's negotiating authority to do TTIP has lapsed. It's going to take a concerted effort on the part of the European Parliament to figure that one out. That's a big obstacle, but it has to get done. And it has to get done for a really counterintuitive reason. President Trump's signature trade deal, USMCA, will fall apart in important ways if the US doesn't get a bilat with the EU. And the reason is simple. Canada has a bilat with the EU. Mexico has a bilat with the EU. So here's the problem. We call it inversion. You're going to witness American firms leaving the United States for both Canada and Mexico. Why? Because they get preferential treatment going into the EU from those countries, but under USMCA, they still get to sell back to the United States under preferential terms as well. Why would I stay in the US given that opportunity? I wouldn't. And we call that inversion. And we're already seeing it. Canada's equivalent of Wall Street, known as Bay Street, has already rolled out the red carpet and pointed out to countless US businesses, come north. You get the EU on preferential terms and you get everything that you take for granted in the status quo at the same time. What a deal. And it's working. And it's working not just in high tech or manufacturing. Witness what's happening to the US lobster industry. It's picking up and moving to Nova Scotia. That is not by accident. Comes down to one simple reality. Based in Canada, your lobsters go into the European Union at 0 tariff. Based in the United States, at best, the tariff is 8%. Do the math.
Yeah, I mean, it's striking. And Mark, as we close out, before we turn to questions from our audience, trade has entered the popular political conversation in a way that it really hasn't in recent years. How do you? I mean, one of our aims with the podcast TradeCraft is talking about trade in an informed way, showing the benefits of free trade. But how do you think in general the media handles trade and is discussing some of these trade issues?
Media coverage is far better than it once was. It used to be rather painful to take an interview with any given newspaper reporter. There are some highly specialized and very talented reporters out there covering trade. That's new, and that's for the better. But I worry that one reason that trade is making such a foray into the public discourse, despite the fact that historically it's been a low salience issue, is that politicians are using it as a means of hitting back against globalization writ large. They're signaling their competence, in other words, by pointing to trade problems that really aren't causing the problems that they're trying to fix. When you have so much job loss to automation, but you know as a politician that you can't run against technology, what are you going to do? You're going to run against trade. Trade has one very convenient fact. It comes with a flag. And even though supply chains are so much more complicated than that one flag, the reality is we get this neat in-group, out-group dynamic by which politicians can signal competence. It's tough to know what to say to your constituents when you're staring down a financial crisis or you're dealing with the fact that wage depression has set in by virtue of automation. When you're in that situation, what's the go-to? Trade. And that requires exactly this, a discussion, an honest discussion, maybe even with some data, but the media are catching on, and it certainly is much more enjoyable to field interviews these days than it used to be.
Well, let's take the time now to expand our discussion to the audience. So taking on our first question, is agriculture fully covered in the EU bilats with Canada and Mexico, and would it be covered in a bilat with the US?
So let's break apart what agriculture means. Historically, agriculture has meant things that fall under the WTO's agreement on agriculture. We think subsidy, we think tariffs. You're going to get some carve-outs on the tariffs no matter what you do. The EU will give you 99% zero tariffs. The 1% that it will retain will be ag. That's not what I'm talking about with respect to ag, though. What I want to emphasize with respect to ag in the US is the need to get more science-based health and safety standards, which in trade we call sanitary and phytosanitary standards, and to deal with what are called technical barriers to trade. That's the future. And in the technical barriers to trade field, you're talking about 93% of all US exports being implicated by some regulatory measure abroad.
Can you give us an example of that?
Take an alcohol label in Thailand. Warning labels that have to be changed up every 100 or 1,000 bottles, warning about excessive drinking causes cancer. That is a deterrent to trade. And as you can imagine, it is a focal point and a flashpoint in terms of how the Scotch Whisky Association or the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States view the global landscape. Their problem isn't tariffs. Their problem is labels. Their problem is health and safety warnings and the standards that presumably back up those warnings. That's the future. That's where rich countries battle, and battle in a very clever way. And that's why of all the sectors that will be prominent going into November, agriculture needs more free trade. And it needs more free trade outside the conventional boxes that have always historically defined agricultural trade. This ain't subsidies and it ain't tariffs. It's the cool stuff.
As a reminder to our attendees, you can submit your questions for Marc using the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. Marc, another question for you. Can you explain what you think of the Northern Ireland Protocol? Was it right to have the EU govern internal UK market regulations? I don't know if you can speak to that, but
it's been a lightning rod. It's been subject to considerable debate on both sides of the Atlantic as well as in Brussels. I really don't have much to add to what's been said about this. This is a very difficult political situation that has big trade implications, but it's really not anything that I have anything smart to say about.
Yeah, I mean, and we mentioned the US, EU, some of those sticking points. You know, you said that a US-UK trade deal was also something that should be prioritized and is being prioritized right now by the United States Trade Representative's office. What are the sticking points in a US-UK deal?
The first thing is just to figure out what the UK can offer. And remember, we're talking post-Brexit, its tariff schedule was only released this summer.
Sure.
We're learning a lot about what they're going to do in terms of their own regulatory politics, and so far it seems that it's mapping pretty closely onto what the EU does. Now, if I had my druthers, in a perfect world, I wouldn't be pushing US-UK, I'd be going right to US-EU. US-UK is a sideshow relative to US-EU. If we could have strategically gotten the UK to regulate like we regulate, that would have been a needle in the side of the EU. That could have been entertaining. But the truth is, US-UK pales by comparison to the value, the payoff of US-EU. We need US-EU in a very dramatic way, and not for tariffs, but for the regulatory stuff. And that really is why that text, which remember, under Obama had gotten pretty far, is among the best texts that I think the US has penned to date. We had some really great provisions on my chapter on technical barriers to trade. And we did things in that chapter that I would wager it'll be a while before we see something along those lines again. You may see parts of it in the US-UK deal, but I'm not sure that the UK is ready to play at that level with the US in terms of figuring out things along the TBT lines. So again, sure, Trump wants to do US-UK as a reward, largely tracing back to his fondness for Theresa May. Let's do it. But let's realize that it's a pit stop on the way to the big event.
And Mark, before we close out, we're seeing a resurgence of protectionism, not just in the U.S. but around the world. Give us a defense of free trade, if you would, as we close out.
Let's just end with consumers. I want to offer trade as an equality issue. Fact is that poor families disproportionately bear the burden of protectionism. Think about the most protected sectors in the rich world: ag, clothes, footwear. Well, that's a big, significant chunk of a family's house budget, especially families that are on the poorer side of things. I see trade not as just being some commercial aspiration, but as keeping us in line with the need to ensure that those who can least afford to purchase what they're getting are benefiting from what we love to call the Walmart effect. And the Walmart effect is largely predicated on imports. So minus trade, not only do we have far greater price tags on the things that we need, but we also have what we're seeing over the past couple of years, a politicization of the market in a way that really only the richest firms can make sense of. That's not good for your Wisconsin cheese producer. That's not good for your Iowa farmer who has a variety of crops that really are being harassed not by tariffs, but by health and safety standards. This is what we need to worry about. And I worry that when you think about the biggest cottage industry to grow up as a result of the Section 301 tariffs, it's the legal profession catering to those looking for exclusions. Right. That's what undermined the U.S. at the WTO last week. It's the exclusions that put the lie to the public morals claim. But those exclusions are a reflection of the politics that you transplant on what should be a pretty straightforward commercial transaction. And I worry that at the end of the day, poorer families in rich and poor countries pay too much, and poorer businesses, or at least those lacking the resources of a big conglomerate, end up suffering where they shouldn't be, and for no economic reason, but purely for politics.
Well, it's an inspiring call for free trade, and Mark, it's always so fun to talk with you. Before we close out, I want to just thank the rest of our team at TradeCraft Podcast. They do great research work week in and week out for us, and they're all Georgetown current students or recent alums. So I just want to thank Paco Campos, Hamza Monyuddin, William Harrison Hurt, George Lowenson, Erica Sayers, and Katie Lott. So thank you, Kelly. I'm going to turn it back over to you. Mark, great talking to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank you, Mark and Colin, for taking the time to have this discussion with our community. Thank you to our audience for joining today and taking part in this conversation. Please look out for our follow-up email, which will include more information on upcoming programs, as well as a feedback survey and link to today's recording. Have a great afternoon, and thank you both again.